Yeah, it's interesting. This is a more historical talk, obviously, but it's interesting to delve into Lilburn and his relationship with other composers. I've done that a number of times. Only the second time publicly, you could say. The first time was an excerpt, an article rather, in Canzona 2004, where I claimed that Edwin Carr deliberately set out in his compositional career to write one piece ahead of Lilburn in each genre, meaning he wrote 4 symphonies as opposed to Lilburn's 3, and 3 piano sonatas as to Lilburn's 2 that were known at that stage, and he deliberately wrote 10 concert studies to outdo Lilburn's 9 short pieces. And I reread that a few weekends ago, and I'm still reasonably convinced, but this is a less audacious topic. We really know about Lilburn's feeling for the landscape and the influence. We just have to listen to his Chaconne for piano after his tramping trip in the West Coast to get that. But your musical language has to come from somewhere, unless you're doing literal imitations of bird songs, or has to be influenced by somebody. So we know in the traditional list that Lilburn, as we read in books, is influenced by Vaughan Williams, Sibelius, Schubert, Bartok, Schoenberg's 12-tone, etc., a bit of Copland's, etc., etc., etc. There are no New Zealand composers in that list, sadly. They're all from the other side of the world. You may have think of New Zealand, perhaps before Lilburn, as a composerless land. If you do, you might like to purchase my CD of early New Zealand piano miniatures, which I meant to bring up and wave, but which I recorded a couple of years ago, early New Zealand piano miniatures from 1900 to 1960. There were composers, obviously, before Lilburn, and my suggestion was that Lilburn was, in fact, influenced by one of these composers. I'm not talking here of Alfred Hill, who was largely gone from the scene in New Zealand even before Lilburn was born, really, and who Lilburn hoped would be some sort of John the Baptist figure, which he's rather disappointed at. I know the person I'm referring to is Ernest Jenner, who was born in 1892 in England, so he's 23 years older than Lilburn. He performed under Henry Wood, and he was a sub-professor at the Royal Academy of Music. So looking again at my title, Homegrown, I might regret that word now. He was an English composer, but he came to live eventually in New Zealand in the late 1920s, went to Christchurch Teachers College, where he had a position there until he retired in 1954. He was devoted to music education. The Dominion Songbooks, his most famous contribution. He developed sight singing courses in the classroom, wrote articles, church music course for Catholic schools, radio broadcaster schools. He conducted, he performed, he was the press critic, he adjudicated, and he composed in his free time, which wasn't very much, as you can understand from that. He really just a handful of songs and a few sets of published piano pieces. So who were Ernest Jenner's influences? Mainly English pastoral. Ravel was influenced Ernest Jenner, sorry, not the other way around. Chromatic subtle shifts, occasionally bits of whole tone scales, tone semitone scales. So if we could have example number 1, thanks. This is just a bit of 4 bars of Ernest Jenner's Grace from his Summer Impressions, just to get the idea. Mark, so that's a piece that begins in E flat and ends up in E major. Then he goes back to E flat, and through a few subtle harmonic shifts he ends up in D major. Did they know each other, these two composers? They did indeed. Ernest Jenner taught Lilburn in 1936 for his preparation for his performer's LRSM, which sadly he didn't pass, but only one person out of 15 passed from the examiner, Michael Head, so may not be due to Ernest Jenner's teaching. So it was 1936 that they worked together. Lilburn had just written his composition Forest in 1935, which won the Percy Grainger Prize. So they must have discussed composition, surely, between them, two fellow composers. Despite the generation gap, Ernest Jenner was a late starter, and his composition sort of flourished, as they say, about the same time as Lilburn's. And Ernest Jenner's successors came later than Lilburn's. He won the Charles Begg Music Composers Contest in 1943, 1944 and 1948 for his piano pieces. Lilburn was back in Christchurch by then, so he surely knew about Jenner's successes and his compositions. There was a differences of style. Lilburn preferred the bold contours of the landscape, mountains, hills, waterscapes, whereas Jenner was essentially a minimalist. He wrote a lot of music about flowers and sort of sensitivity of flowers, the delicate sort of side of things. But there are similarities. Jenner liked lots of parallel fourths, strings of parallel fourths. Often his melodies had a fourth underneath them to create a sort of a bell-like feel. So could we have extract number 2, which is the beginning of Jenner's Foxglove Bells. Very much. So you can hear the bell-like sounds with the series of fourths. Here's a fourth, he goes down a tone, and he goes down a fourth, and he goes up a tone. And underneath there are fifths, sort of holding the fort. So now, as extract 3, could we listen to the second of Lilburn's 2 Christmas pieces from 1949? This is 5 years later. Thanks, Mark. Very much. So there we've got a series of fourths in the top. The fourths go up a tone, then they go down a fourth, and then to a single note. And there are fifths underneath, just like the Jenner extract. Looking later in Lilburn's work, there are lots of fourths creeping into his sonata in 1956, especially in the first movement, which is a horrendous piece to play, really. It's very tricky. I've always avoided performing it, so I can't really ask anyone else to volunteer that. So moving into the 1960s and 70s, Lilburn has a lot of chordal harmony in his work, especially in the 9 short pieces and in something which was originally called Crotchety at 51, which was a sort of a folio of music that he came up to Margaret Nielsen and said rather crotchetarily, perhaps, see what you can make of these, or whatever she said. They're often sort of bell-like parallel fourths, but they're often compounded. What I mean is there's a note, there's a fourth above, and there's a note that's a fourth above that as well. I'll call them compound fourths. In the number 18 of the 18 short pieces, which has now been renamed short piece, a standalone piece, this is a piece made up almost entirely of fourths. This is extract 4, so could have a listen to that. Thanks, Mark. Great, thanks. So the Ernest Jenner's Foxglove Bells fourths, they went down a tone and then down a fourth. In this extract, there are compound fourths in the right hand, which you heard there. They go up a fourth and they go down a tone. So now let's look at a more specific figure, if the generalities haven't convinced you. This is a figure in Jenner's Foxglove Bells, which we heard as extract 2. It's just a 3-note figure. There's 2 grace notes sort of crushed into a lower note. So he has one note, in his context, a slightly lower note, and falling down to a note, a fourth below in Jenner's context. So could we have just to listen to that 3-note figure by itself? Thanks, Mark. That's right, and that's the one, yes. And in the context of the piece, thanks. Thanks very much. So that little figure tends to creep into Lilburn's works. There's a little hints of it in Sonata 1956, but it comes up in the 9 short pieces, in number 2, a little bit in number 4, number 6, and certainly number 9. And it's definitely in Lilburn's Sonata number 2, which is written in 1962. It happens several times in the first movement, and in the third movement, it's the very first thing that you hear in the right hand. So could we have example number 6? Thanks, Mark. All right, thanks very much. So you heard the little in the right hand, the very first thing we heard. it's slightly expanded or augmented in terms of the intervals being slightly wider than the little Jenner motif, which, well, let's call the foxglove motif, otherwise it takes a while to describe. So that was the opening of the third movement of the Sonatita number 2. Later on in the third movement, which is example number 7, he really goes to town on this movement. He has that little Jenner motif 15 times in the 25 bars of the third movement. So could we have example number 7? Thanks. Great, so there's the Jenner motif, the foxglove motif, and it's happening about 7 times in a row. In his later pieces, Lilburn combines these two, the fourths, parallel fourth or the compound fourth with another fourth on top, with the rhythm of that figure. So he's combining the two things we've just talked about, going up and down. The 9 short pieces, especially number 9, has lots of fourth, simple and compound going in parallel, going up and down in that same rhythm we just heard that Jenner has. It's a fairly spiky piece, whereas let's listen to a short extract of C change number 3, or number 3 from his 3 C changes, which is a more bell-like piece, which is similar to the Ernest Jenner piece that Mark played earlier. There's not quite as many of these examples, but it's a more Jenner-like piece, perhaps. So example 8, thanks, Mark. That's right. So we heard the down at the bass we had a very low, a fourth with a fourth on top going up, and then he had one going down, and then we had another compound fourth going up, and those some sort of diddle-um rhythm. So we've had two things there. We've had lots and lots of fourths that Lilburn appear to have got from Jenner. We've had that little rhythmic motif, and then we've had Lilburn combining these two things. Here we go. So let's look in a little bit more detail of a specific piece of Lilburn's with a specific piece of Jenner's. The one I'm looking at is C change number 2, which is written in 1950. So the C here would be the Wellington C, perhaps off Paikokariki, where Lilburn had moved to fairly recently. It's marked Allegro Assai. It's essentially a 9/8. Here's a 9/8, 3/4 time signature, but it's essentially 9/8 with 9 quavers a bar, rapid swirling sort of figures with figures sort of curling around on themselves, going up and down the keyboard in octaves, swirling things. So it's not hard to imagine the C sort of swirling around and curving in on a pan itself. So extract number 9, thanks, Mark. Thanks very much. I should have actually added the next bar down where he goes down another octave. That's the one, thank you very much. Yes. I did say that in my emails to Glenda, I said, I don't think the extracts will be, I can't imagine them being any longer than 40 bars in total, so now I'm sort of thinking, maybe not. So it was 40 bars exactly, except for the 41st, which Mark just played in. Thank you, Mark. You get an extra few dollars for that. So let's compare this with the first of Ernest Jenner's 2 outdoor sketches, which won the Beggs competition in 1944 and published in 1945. They are mostly triplet 9/8 quavers. It's actually written in 3/4, but it's essentially 9/8 as in the Lilburn quavers. They are swirling figures, they curl around on themselves, they go up and down the keyboard in octaves. So let's listen to the short extract of number 10. Thanks. Thanks. So that's another swirling motif, but this time it was, instead of Lilburn's one going down an octave and down another octave, this one's going up an octave each time. This piece has nothing to do with the C. It didn't seem to be Ernest Jenner's thing to write things about the C and that sort of thing. This is called skating. So from the whole piece you can imagine that a skater sort of curling around on themselves and making other sort of skating patterns. About getting towards the end of C change number 2, there is a cadenza, essentially a cadenza. Now you think, oh, what is Douglas Lilburn doing writing cadenzas? Didn't write any operas, didn't write any concertos. There don't seem to be any other cadenza-like figures that I can have seen in Lilburn's work, really. But this is very much a cadenza. So could we hear this extract number 11? Thanks, now. Excellent, very excellently played. Thank you very much. Not an easy piece to play, that one. It's not marked. This is a cadenza. But it's essentially it's notated as in its 3/4-9/8. But it's got a very much a cadenza feel, and it's still played in recordings of the pieces, very much in a cadenza-like feel, like a free rhythmic feel. Michael Houston more so than Dan Poynton, but both very much so, and Mark Menzies. Near the end of this piece, Skating, that I'm comparing these two pieces with, there was a cadenza. You sort of think, what's Ernest Jenner doing writing a cadenza? He never wrote any operas, never wrote any concertos. There is a slight cadenza in the Foxglove Bells, which you heard in extract number 2, but apart from that, it doesn't seem to be a particular characteristic. So could we have extract number 12? This is Ernest Jenner's cadenza. Thanks. It's a much simpler cadenza, but there are similarities. Lilburn's cadenza starts very low, it races up several octaves and goes swirling back down low, whereas Ernest Jenner's cadenza starts very high, it runs all the way down several octaves and then goes running all the way back again. And both cadenzas have very much an E minor sort of feeling about them. Was this a coincidence? I don't think so, no. It seemed the similarities between these two pieces seem a bit more than coincidence to me. Lilburn's was written in 1950, Ernest Jenner's was published in 1945 when Lilburn was still living in Christchurch, so he would surely have known about this sort of thing. Well, that's the end of the extracts that I had planned. Just some other remarks. Did they get on? Well, Lilburn studied with Jenner for a while, obviously, as I mentioned before. They had a fairly public disagreement after a tribute performance that Lilburn conducted a piece of, which didn't quite go quite right. Apparently the soprano came in and beat a bar early or late. Lilburn got a bit flustered and he grabbed all the scores and walked off, and followed by the performers. Somebody complained to the paper. Lilburn wrote a piece justifying it, which seemed to blame the soprano. And his old teacher, Ernest Jenner, wrote a piece to the paper saying, well, I don't think that's very fair that this person should have been blamed. There's some correspondence in the Jenner archive in the National Library where Lilburn wrote a sort of a curt explanation to Jenner. And Jenner wrote a letter back saying, I won't read it all, but saying, though I'm sorry that you continue to see things from your original angle, for there was another way in which it could have been dealt with, I'm nonetheless pleased that you wrote to me, saying that I didn't write out of enmity towards you or anything like that. May we leave it that you and I retain, underline, the friendly relations that previously existed. I am sincerely Ernest Jenner. Originally it was marked, Dear Mr. Lilburn, so it's a very formal letter from his old teacher. I'm not sure whether they did retain friendly relations. Looking at the Jenner archives in the National Library a year or so ago, Ernest Jenner played a lot of New Zealand music in his performances. He performed quite a lot. Composers like Ray Estell and Temple White, which are so obscure they're not even on my CD of early New Zealand piano miniatures. But there's lots of programs there, but I couldn't find anything of Lilburn. Strange that Lilburn was the most well-known composer, wrote some very approachable music which could have been performed by Jenner, but doesn't seem to be any performances of Lilburn there, which is his old student. Jenner later on in his life was elected a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Music, and there were lots of letters of congratulations written to Jenner, which he obviously valued because he kept them and they end up in the Jenner archive. All sorts of people, the good and the great, writing to him saying congratulations. No letter from Lilburn there. Could have written maybe, but doesn't seem to be anything there. So who knows? Just some concluding remarks. The sea change number 3, which we heard a bit earlier on, is the most Jenner-like, I think, of Lilburn's pieces. As I said before, there's some very bell-like fourths. There's lots of parallel fourths, compound fourths. They're going up and down in that foxglove Jenner rhythm that I mentioned earlier. It occurred to me that, having been written in 1972, it was written not long after Jenner had died. And I sort of wondered, well, I wonder if that's a tribute to his old teacher, maybe even grudgingly. That might be going a bit too far. I'm not sure about that, but I hope I've shown that there was some sort of a composer living in New Zealand who had some influence on Lilburn that perhaps hasn't been known about so far. Yes, Ernest Jenner was an English composer, that's true. He'd been here 20 years or so before the pieces he wrote had influenced Lilburn. So, I mean, maybe he was imbued with some sort of New Zealand spirit that may have passed on to Lilburn, I'm not sure. Maybe the flowers that he was describing were New Zealand flowers, or maybe he wrote a piece called Sunset, maybe it was the sunset over the Alps, rather than an English sunset that he was writing about. I'm not sure, but perhaps we'll never know. But the final thing for me is to thank Mark Menzies very much for performing the